questions you may have, and we'll have some time at the end where you questions. We'll also have a few polls coming up here on the webinar. So here we go. My special thanks to Kiana Stone as well as the Inclusion and Equity Committee for sponsoring this webinar. Okay, an overview of kind of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about microaggression as a concept, and it's my understanding that that's relatively new in student affairs. We haven't talked about it a lot in the region. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about what it is and the different parts. It's actually kind of a continuum idea with 3 distinct areas, and we'll talk more about that as we go. In addition, we're going to talk about to understand privilege, oppression, specifically the experiences of our students and our peers that experience privilege and oppression in a negative way. And then finally, a time to reflect on our examples. There's some quotes and polls there where we can talk about that a little bit. And then we'll also talk a little bit about a specialized approach to some of these situations. So here we go. What is microaggression? Though it may be a bit of a new or fresh oppression for us, the concept was actually coined back in 1970 by Dr. Chester Pierce. It was first applied to the experiences of racial minorities. Specifically, Dr. Pierce did his research with what he labeled as Black individuals or Black Americans as well as Asian Americans. Microaggression is the way we continuum of experiences that both invalidate our minority students and also impact their experiences, not just in the significant incident, but also their experiences at our institutions. The way I look at microaggression and its components is that it is a small but significant experience from our students. And we'll talk a little bit later about what it means to have small but significant experiences over and over and over again. So thinking about this as a continuum, I use a Venn diagram features. Very excited I figured out how to do the animations on PowerPoint, and it actually worked this time, so please enjoy the visuals. So we're going to talk about 3 areas. We're going to talk about microassault. Microaggression. You'll notice in this kind of continuum, I think you might start getting as most severe to least severe. And that is somewhat intentional, but we are going to talk about how these overlap. My perspective on this is that they are all interconnected. One would not exist without the other. So when we look at microinvalidation, microinvalidations build a culture and a community where micro-insult can and do happen. And then the combination of those 2 existing is what also allows for, encourages, and supports micro-assault experience. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. So let's talk about micro-assault. A bit tech is basically an explicit derogation characterized primarily by a local or nonverbal attack meant to hurt. So what people might call kind of old-fashioned racism, overt discrimination, intentional harm, those kind of things. I think at some of our campuses we would call those bias incidents or acts of intolerance or hate crimes or those kind of things. So the big part about microassault to take away is that these are very explicit. They can be physical, verbal, emotional, and they are intentional. So our first poll here, and I'm a little bit new to the poll thing, but I'm just going to take a poll of our participants. Do we see this on their campus? You should be able to do the poll here in the GoToWebinar, and the question is yes, no, or I don't know. My screen is telling me the poll is in progress.
Jess, you see that, correct?
I see a little screen telling me that it is sharing poll results, but I don't see the actual results.
Okay, we're at 82% yes and 18% unsure.
18, okay, excellent. All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Rudy. I might need your help here because I'm not sure if I'm looking at the right section.
No problem.
So 82% saying yes, we definitely see it, and then an 18% being unsure. So am I correct that there was 0 for the no answer?
Yes. You are correct.
What I was kind of getting at is I think that in our experiences as residence life and student affairs professional, we definitely know about and see this. Otherwise, we anticipate that we may. That's where a lot of our policies about bias and hate incidents come from. For further, this is more for even if you're on your own or a little short group discussion, but thinking about, okay, how do we respond to these things? For those of you that have known it's happened on your campus or at a school you've worked at, how do we respond? What do we typically do? And I think while our processes and practices may be different, most of our institutions probably have a pretty clearly articulated policy and or practice for these types of incidents. We probably have something in our student code of conduct about racism, harassment, discrimination, intentional harm, violence, threats, those kind of things, and all of those would kind of cover microassault experiences. So let's move down the continuum to microinsult. Focused on communication. It could be verbal or nonverbal communication that conveys a rudeness or insensitivity towards specific groups. So an example of that would be, someone who makes really rude comments about someone they perceive to be Arab or perceive to be Muslim. The assumption that that person is a terrorist or that person is anti-American, or even if that person is not an American citizen. So again, this is communication, but it's about that rudeness, it's about that insensitivity. So again, poll, do we see this on our campuses?
We're at 100% yes.
100% yes, okay. And that's a pretty expected answer. And again, my intent of answering these kind of yes-no closed-ended questions is just to get a sense of where we're coming from. So clearly we're seeing this around our campuses. So just like with microassault, it's time to ask yourself the same question. How do we typically respond? Again, in some institutions and some, we may have some, again, very structured, focused responses to these incidents. I think one of my institutions that I worked at, we talked about acts of intolerance. Some people call them bias incidents, and some of those would refer to the micro-insult, the physical, the harm, the threat, the intentionality. But with micro-insult, I know that for me, even in a conduct officer role, I sometimes am following up with people who make comments, meaning to hurt someone, meaning to be rude or insensitive, but they themselves don't necessarily see it as aggression, or they don't see it as oppression or privilege related. They're just saying, I was just saying that to, quote unquote, piss somebody off. I think when we start thinking about how do we respond to that, we might be getting into the realm of it's a little more gray, it's a little more murky on how we do it. Okay, Microinvalidation. Comments and behaviors that include the experience of minority identity. And this is where we're getting to the crux of the biscuit, as my grad professors used to say. These are often things that people either A, don't know that they're saying that would be inappropriate, or B, they think they're saying the right thing. I think about that kind of common phrase, I don't see race, I don't see color, I don't find that to be a pertinent issue or relevant to knowing someone. I just like to get to know the person. I think some of us that do social justice work might kind of cringe at the thought, but I can also think back in my lifetime of feeling that way and believing that, for my way of being inclusive and being supportive of all different people is to not judge someone by the color of their skin or by their nation of origin. And so I think, again, we're getting to that. I'm well-meaning, I'm trying to be inclusive, but man, did I, just make it worse. So our final yes and no poll, do we see this on our campuses? And I'm going to place a bet, no, gambling may be illegal, I'm going to place a bet that we're going to get close to 100% response on this one.
If 85% voted, we have 100% yes.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Appreciate that, everyone. Thanks for participating in those kind of quick yes or no polls just to get some perspective. So I would guess that this is actually the things we see most prevalently in our residence halls. You know, I could probably come up with a half dozen examples of this just from sitting in my office for 2 or 3 hours. So definitely some things that we see. But I would also say that even though they are the most common, they are often the most difficult to address and to affect positive change. So as you can see, we're kind of getting that picture of the continuum. And if we reflect back on what I said about how micro-assault, micro-insult, micro-invalidation are all interconnected and interdependent. Invalidation breeds and makes an environment that is healthy and conducive for insult, which those two together make just a really happy little home for people who decide to take it to the next level and be violent and intentional. So the impact of microaggression. So this is where we're getting at what are our experiences of our students. Identity development. If we studied student development theory, we spent maybe a whole semester or half semester on identity development itself. We know that developmentally our students, particularly our FIDIAC kind of traditional age college students, are spending their first few years with us figuring out who they are. And so that's difficult enough. I'm kind of fond of saying it's hard enough to figure out who you are without dealing with additional pressure and what I would call suppression. So basically kind of not trying to figure out who you are, but also getting the conflicting message that what you are is bad, negative, or undesirable. Also, the stress and frustration of always defending someone's identity. You know, and I think back to my early years of being a member of the LGBT community in college and how, you know, as much as I wanted to go out and do pride panels and as much as I educated people and did it, there were points when I would just hit a breaking level and I would be just so stressed and frustrated and think, how many more conversations can I have about the fact that I didn't choose to be the way that I am? Or, you know, I talk with some of my students of color who say, I'm so frustrated and I'm sick of explaining to people that I'm not quote unquote ghetto and that I'm not from an urban area, and I'm sick of people assuming that I've been in a gang or I'm from Detroit or I'm this or I'm that because of how I look. So I think overwhelmingly that this is when we start talking about those small but significant and repeated experiences. It builds up after a while. It's exhausting. So that's where we get to the exhaustion. Not to keep doing it over and over, but also for a minority person or an underrepresented person, it can be really difficult to always feel like you have to be on. You have to have this kind of shield against the people you perceive to be your oppressors or the people that you don't know if you can trust. I think that occurs for people of a lot of identities, especially when we talk about race, ethnicity, we talk about sexual orientation, we talk about political and religious beliefs, and we talk about gender. You know, I think about you know, what it's like for my students that are students of color, and they see me as an authority figure who is white, and maybe or maybe not, their experiences with white authority figures have not been positive, have not been healthy. If that is the case, then that's additional pressure on them to think, okay, well, there's only one hall director. I have to go to her for the things that I want, but how do I know I can trust her? And so I know that I find that my students, especially early on, really kind of put up a front with me or kind of a shield. You know, it takes a little longer for students who've dealt with some of these experiences to let me in or to trust that I'm going to try and do the right thing. I would also say that I don't always get in, and I think that as practitioners that can be frustrating, and at times I'll say I lose some sleep over that. You know, and I worry that, you know, my students, because of a greater social structure, one that I am part of and I contribute to, but also one that I would like to unmake as best I can, it impacts my ability to make relationships with some of my students. So this is more of a personal reflection again. We see this affect our students, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit later on when we've got to the question and answer. Maybe some other experiences you can think of, or times where you think that microaggression and these small, significant, repeated experiences really affect our students in a negative way. So as with most programs, I really like to try and focus on kind of where do we go from here. I know that for me, the discussions of privilege and oppression, the first step is a lot of times acknowledging privilege. And that's been a difficult journey for me, as it is, I think, for a lot of majority folks. I know I was resistant to that in the beginning. And one of the things that frustrated me is, like, what do I do with that? So I say, yes, Jess, you have white privilege. What do I do with that? You have class privilege. What do I do with that? And so one of the things in social justice work I always look for is, where do I go from here? So I like to call it our responsibility. So our ability to respond, if you can kind of see the breakdown there, but also our responsibility to do so. I think anyone who would sign up for a webinar like this would want to take that on is taking a step and saying, I want to make sure my students are supported if they are experiencing these things, but also that I'm not contributing. I think the biggest thing is to validate those experiences. You know, and I have it there 3 times. And now I'm going to back up just here a little bit, and I want to show you kind of some examples of some of these other experiences. Yes, enjoying my lovely toolbar there. Okay, so remember we talked about this kind of continuum. And what I did here is I provided a number of examples that I could think of, and I'll tell you this is definitely not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to kind of run through some things. And I set up some of them kind of a continuum, so I connected some with identities, but I also provided some other experiences that I myself have observed. Most of the incidents right on here I've observed in my professional life, so in the last 3 to 5 years of my career. So I know some of these might sound like they are relatively kind of old school racism or the kind of overt stuff that we don't think we experience, but these are things that I have first-person experience with. So this first line here, this was kind of a continuum setup. So I said the micro-assault, we're talking about international students. I think international students are some of our population that in diversity and social justice work we don't always quite remember the unique experiences. And then I think for our students, you know, our students deal with everything from, you know, people looking them right in the face and saying, get out, why are you in my country? Or you're not even American, or why you don't want to be American, so why do you get to use my educational options? And, you know, the idea that they're quote unquote taking our spots in higher education. Our international students experience this on a consistent basis. Now moving across to that micro insult level, you know, I think we see this in the residence halls a lot, especially with, you know, roommate matching. If international students are placed with other students that are from a different culture, particularly U.S. students, there's often, that's one of those kind of situations where we find a roommate issue where someone comes and says they don't shower, or they always, they smell differently, or there's this, and it's very awkward, and you know, they're not willing to talk to that person because hygiene is different in different cultures. Expectations are different, and that's not necessarily a negative thing, but it can be a big culture shock for our students. And then finally, this kind of micro-invalidation, and I would say these are more of the things that are not necessarily happening always with international students present, but it creates a culture. And so I think of my students who on their Facebook pages and in their conversations in the lobby and talking about things even at diversity programs, this kind of assumption that if you're not from the U.S., you must be a terrorist, particularly if you're from an Arab-speaking country or if you identify as Muslim. You know, just this kind of assumption of it and this kind of distrust of all things that are not, all people that are not from the U.S. So you kind of get the idea again of that continuum idea. So some other examples of micro-assault. Someone who intentionally uses the word Oriental. You know, that's something that's kind of fallen out of favor, and I think my experience is most folks will respond very well if you explain to them why that's not necessarily very inclusive or that it doesn't recognize the diversity of a community. But I occasionally will run into people that will just, you know, say it as in a very derogatory, like, they're an Oriental person, like they're this or that, or making assumptions, and they're doing it knowing full well they're being insulting. Some other examples, one of the institutions I work at, a same-sex couple walked across campus holding hands, and another student walked right up to them and spit on them. Verbal insult to interracial couples, and I would say, you know, as a member of the queer community, I see this both in same-sex and opposite-sex relationships. And people making very direct comments to someone and saying, "What are you doing with her?" Or, "Great, you're taking, you know, you're just wasting a really great white person, black person, Latino person, Asian person by mixing the blood." Displaying a swastika. You know, people have the right to freedom of speech and freedom of expression, but I would find it very hard to believe that anyone would think that putting a swastika out is not an assault to certain people in the community. Online harassment. This is becoming more and more prevalent. People calling each other names. I mean, online bullying. I see this a lot between my female students, and that's mostly anecdotal evidence there, but I definitely see women that call each other some really hurtful, harmful language. You know, using the word nigger or N-word or any other racial derogatory word. Using a hurtful word with intent. One of my favorite examples of that is someone who, you know that they know that saying someone's retarded or saying someone's gay is offensive because someone sat down and had that conversation. And they know there are people around them that don't respond well, but they do it anyway. They just refuse to take any responsibility for the impact of their words. Sexual assault. Might seem a little out of place, but since sexual assault is about power and control, the vast majority of reported victims of sexual assault are women. There is a gender component to that. However, you know, anyone who is sexually assaulted, I mean, I think we can make the connection there that definitely a very significant form of oppression. The using of the phrase lynch as if it doesn't have an impact on certain folks. I've had roommate and house or floor conflicts where a student will throw out, be like, we'll just lynch them all and get done with it. And the difference of using the word lynch versus we'll just kick them all out or we'll just beat them up or we'll just kill them has a very significant experience because of its historical context. Calling someone that you know has a disability a retard. I think that one's pretty common, and we would recognize it as such. So again, microassault. Those are, again, those significant, usually physical and or verbal, emotional, with intent to harm. So any of these things, I would say that for the most part, they are intending to cause harm and frustration and hurt to the other person. So micro-insult, giving a few more examples. You know, we talked about international student hygiene. We said, assuming all Asian cultures are the same, you know, assuming that everyone who, in your quote, looks Asian, believes the same thing, has the same values. All Asian or Asian American women are this way, all Asian men are this way. Or just the idea that somehow Asian only means Japanese and Chinese. I think that's a perception in the U.S. You know, when we start talking about Southeast Asia and what ethnic and racial diversity looks like there, someone we might assume as another race is actually would identify themselves as Asian. Trying to convince a queer person to be straight. You know, I think I have seen this in student organizations and even within house and floor communities where someone will sit a person down and try to convince them that they're not queer or convince them that being straight is the most important way. And so, again, kind of sort of moving to the invalidation where they mean well, but this falls into micro-insult for me because it's very intentional, it's very focused communication trying to tell them that what you are is not right, and let me tell you how to be right. Whispering at interracial couples. Interracial marriage has been legal in the United States for a long time, yet I know from speaking with friends of all different sexual orientations that being part of an interracial couple, you are very likely to get stares, get whispers, have people looking at you strangely, especially if you're in a less than diverse area where in a business or in a restaurant or particularly in some very conservative rural areas. Ignoring multiple identities. I think that can take the form of a lot of things. I mean, someone who is either applauding someone or encouraging someone to pass as one or the other, or someone who says, you know, you know, one of my parents is black and one of my parents is white, but because their skin is dark, people refer to them as black, instead of respecting that multiple identities exist and responding to the people the way they ask to be. Changing class because of an accent. I hear this story a lot where students say, I withdrew from that class, I switched sections because I couldn't understand the professor. And that's a touchy one because I think that's a balance of, you know, needing to get my academics in line and make sure I can do some, but also to me, it's a very ethnocentric kind of, you know, intolerant view. Is like, I'm just not going to deal with you because I can't understand you and I'm not going to take the time. Blowing off requests to change language. So again, you know, not necessarily using the words as a way to hurt someone, but just, you know, you hear it, you know it's wrong. Sometimes these folks even catch themselves when they're talking to you in your office, but they just keep doing it. Physically pulling away from a person of color. I know this happens out in public quite a bit, public transportation or sitting down on a bench, where people kind of scooch away or involuntarily, you know, kind of unintentionally or subconsciously clutch a purse or kind of flinch a little bit when someone who looks or sounds or smells or acts a different way sits next to them. Victim blaming. I think when we want to talk about the connection between micro-insult and micro-assault, victim blaming is a direct correlation and connection to the fact that sexual assault is so prevalent. So basically, by blaming anyone who is hurt, a victim of sexual assault or physical assault, violence, threats, and making it like somehow they required it or expected it or did something to deserve it. Displaying nonverbal fear or hatred, so those looks of disgust, those looks of, oh my gosh, who is that person, you know, looking at someone with an angry face and, you know, not necessarily coming into their space and saying, you know, I'd love to drop you where you stand or actually taking the intent to do that, but clearly, you know, they're thinking it. Also staring at mobility or sensory aids. I know I work with a student right now who has an auditory impairment. He uses hearing aids. I've known him for about 1.5 years. He's a perfectly nice guy, likes to make new friends, but I noticed that he's kind of a loner in the hall. And I've noticed that when students interact with him, they often are staring at his hearing impairment, or they get frustrated because he asks them sometimes to repeat what they've said. You know, and instead of taking on the responsibility of just making sure, you know, you look that person in the face when you're talking. He reads lips and can hear pretty well, but I think folks really stare at his sensory aids. I also see that a lot with people who are visually impaired or blind. I think that somehow folks think, well, if they must be blind because they're using a seeing stick, I can stare at them, they're not going to know. Or staring at someone who's talking in sign, who's clearly having a conversation. It's basically eavesdropping. It's very rude, but folks think they're kind of entitled to do that because that person's different. So again, moving along the continuum, microassault, the intentional intent to create harm, the physical, verbal, threatening things. Microinsult, maybe less of the intent to create harm, but just kind of the I'm going to be rude to you, I'm going to be, communicating in an inappropriate way, and I don't care if it hurts. And then we move to the microinvalidation, and that's really where our focus is for this session, is that those kind of well-meaning or unintentional things. So a lot of microinvalidation, as well as these other areas, a lot of it's based on stereotypes and preconceived notions about these individuals. And I think sometimes this microinvalidation is what I call my privilege or my oppressive concepts of power and privilege, all those things. It's leaking out of me. It leaks out in unintentional ways, or ways that I'm not always fully conscious of until I reflect. So I think there's some examples there, making some assumptions about people, a lot of assumptions, a lot of beliefs. Assuming that all Latino and Latina people speak Spanish. I've had students, and I've observed this, students who are studying Spanish walk up to someone they believe is Latin and start speaking in Spanish, and the person looks at them and said, I don't speak Spanish, how are you doing today? Making that assumption. Disbelieving or discounting anyone who says that they're both queer and religious, particularly queer and Christian. I know that some of my students in the LGBT student group I work with don't feel welcome in other groups because they're basically told, if you want to be part of this, you have to be one thing. You can't be both. We're not going to talk about that. And so that's an example. There's student groups that are unwelcoming to people that are different. This is a big one here. Rationalizing and apologizing for behavior. I think this is one of those things that those of us that are very well-meaning and want to help others feel better and minimize the impact, we're very quick to apologize and say, I'm really sorry that person said to you, that was rude. And while I think that can be an opener for a conversation in an appropriate setting, I think it's a very kind of privileged standpoint to say, let me just apologize on behalf of that other person, that other man, that other white person, that other student staff member, that other hall director for saying that inappropriate thing. I'm sorry. It's kind of like doing that benevolent kind of thing and kind of playing into that whole I'm better, I can make it all better, I can make it go away. Making a student feel bad for being angry. I know this is something I really had to work on with myself, is having students come into a conduct meeting who maybe feel that they've been targeted because of their identity. And even sometimes when I know that that is not the core of the incident, or I don't believe that it is, letting them get that out a little bit and talk about why they felt that way, and try to help quantify that a little bit, but not trying to make them feel bad that they're angry. I've had students apologize to me, like, I'm so sorry, I yelled at you a few minutes ago. I'm just really frustrated because I feel like I can't be here and be myself because this institution is not safe for Black people. I think there's been a few times where I've had that happen, and I said, you know what, I appreciate what you're saying, and I think you're talking about a maturity thing about making sure you're not expressing your anger inappropriately. I said, however, the feeling is real, and the feeling is absolutely yours and absolutely valid, should be validated. Asking minorities to be a spokesperson, we usually call that token syndrome. I think there is a very unplanned way of doing that. We hear about a professor calling on and saying, can you please tell us what it is from the male perspective, since you're the only male in the room, tell us about that. And kind of putting someone on the spot. But I also think we sometimes do that with good intentions and with diversity and education in mind. I advise our Pride panel process here. That's really what I'm doing, is I'm providing people with the opportunity to go out and speak on behalf of their community. And I think while I clearly advocate for Pride panels, and I would not say we shouldn't do them, I think it's also our responsibility as advisors to make sure that we're providing the adequate training and support to those who choose to do that. All of my students do it voluntarily, but we used to sit through an hour-and-a-half training before they ever do a Pride panel. We also make sure that there's a professional staff member at almost every Pride panel to make sure we're there in case things turn sour, and also to follow up with those who maybe share something very emotional or who don't get a good response. So I think it's important that we provide that support to our students, even if they are coming forward and volunteering. Refusing to use a preferred identity. We talked a little bit about that when we talk about ignoring multiple identities, but I would also say when it comes to things like gender and sexuality. If a student tells you, I identify as bi, well, maybe you have some personal feelings about bisexuality and whether it exists or not, but it doesn't give you a license to call that person gay without their permission. And I think sometimes we do that, or we don't take enough steps to make sure we're recognizing that. Also clearly a significant experience for any of our transgender or gender variant students. If a student tells you they'd like to be referred to as a certain name, I think it's our responsibility to do our best to do that. Does that mean that we can go and change every record in the campus, or that that person's legal name won't still show up? That's true, but it doesn't mean that I can't, when I write a note to their RA about them to ask them to check on something, or when I talk to the student, that I can't use their preferred identity. This next one's kind of interesting. I think assuming that introverted equals troubled, that actually came up during Michael Kuh's session. It was really interesting to start thinking about this assumption that someone who is into goth culture, or someone who is what the students now call kind of emo, or someone who is a bit of a loner or likes to kind of be on their own and have their space, that automatically means they're troubled. I have a case study example that I'll provide as a resource where, I sometimes have my student staff talk about how so-and-so is weird, or so-and-so is just, is hard to get to know, or is strange, and I've interacted with that student. It's not that. They're just not big group people, and so they do much better on the one-to-one level. When they call them to house programs, if they come, they kind of hang back and chill, or maybe just kind of latch on to a roommate or a friend on the floor. So I think just kind of assuming that if you're not outgoing and bubbly, that somehow you are, extremely troubled and somebody that needs to be fixed or to be dragged out into the public. Ignoring or justifying concerns. I think anyone coming to you is just automatically being like, I'm sure that's not what they meant. And, I've definitely caught myself doing this when there's been concerns with my student staff. And I think listening to a student and saying, wow, I think this is something I need to follow up on, and thinking about it as, our student staff have certain experiences and feelings and beliefs as well, but also making sure we're validating our students. And then finally, I put on there planning events in an inaccessible space. I think that's a really easy mistake that we can make, especially if we're in buildings that are not retrofitted, that are not fully accessible. I worked at an institution once, and we had 2 programming spaces. One was on the first floor and had a short ramp next to the staircase. Another was in the basement, and there was no ramp or elevator to the basement. Now, the one in the basement was actually a little bit bigger and a little bit nicer and much quieter, and so in some ways it was a better programming space. However, one of the things I challenged my student leaders and the whole council to do was to do more programs up on the first floor in the area that was accessible. Even though we didn't have anyone living in the building at the time who utilized a wheelchair, one of the things I put out there is, what about someone on crutches? What if someone who's coming to hang out with a friend? Do we want to give them the idea that they aren't welcome or they can't be here? And so I think that's a great way to bring awareness to that and get our students really thinking about it. So again, some more functional experiences. I bet we could probably spend all day writing more of them, but I wanted to provide this as a tool or as some information in case you want to share this with others. So back to our spreadsheet, to our PowerPoint. So responsibility. We talked about validation, validating those experiences, acknowledging, providing our students the support and meeting them where they're at. If they need to vent, that is okay. I try to create my office as a safe space, and when a student comes in and says, can I talk to you about something, I immediately get up, I put a note on the door saying I'm with the student, I shut the door, and I focus on them. And those are all good listening skills, but I think that has created an environment where my students who are frustrated with RAs, are frustrated with their peers, are frustrated with faculty or staff around campus, even sometimes my peers within our department will come to me and we'll sit down and talk and we'll work on a plan. I've actually facilitated some dialogue between students and my peers and other staff on campus when they've had a concern or they feel they've been mistreated, and I've really encouraged them. I said, I will go with you, but let you do the talking, and why don't you share those with them? And those have gone very well. I think empathize with the emotional and cognitive toll. This is my kind of fancy way of saying being patient with the affected parties. I think that's something that a lot of us kind of develop as we mature, but I also know that sometimes it's really easy to be frustrated when someone's angry or when someone's expressing themselves in a way that I don't approve of, or maybe it's got what I would perceive as a yelling or raised voice, but realizing that inside their own emotions and dealing with that they're getting it out, and that sometimes it's not intended or it's not always directed at me. And so I think that's just, for me, giving some patience and relaxing a little bit and making sure that we're giving them some space to talk. Be clear about your expectations for reporting and addressing. If you don't have a procedure, maybe it's time to try to start thinking about that. If we don't have a procedure at university-wide and there's not an opportunity to do that, maybe talking within your department or even within your staff team, what are we going to do when these things happen? I know that it's very clear in our student staff expectations at our department that if any of those things happen, you are to report it to a hall director immediately. I let my students, and that's a pretty inclusive list. You know, I include things like on there like sexual assault, violence, threats, anyone going to the hospital, and then I also put on there any kind of vandalism of a discriminatory nature or any kind of threat or anything related to diversity or diverse identity. So it's one of those things that we make sure that there's a reporting agent, and then how do we address it? How can we be consistent? Biting down on defensiveness, that for me is more of a personal challenge. Even if you didn't mean it, even if you've been misunderstood, you know, it's important that we take responsibility for our actions. I think I've had some pretty clear experiences this year where in trying to do the right thing, I have made mistakes. I have said it wrong. I have, you know, used the wrong language. I have had my own privilege get in the way of my being able to understand or empathize with my students. And, you know, I'm not perfect, and sometimes I have to do that. But I also sometimes have to take the feedback. I know that there was definitely some rebuilding there. There are some students that still will not trust me because of that incident or those incidents. I have to take responsibility for that and make peace with that. Some of that's providing some forgiveness for myself, and some of it's giving some forgiveness to the student and realizing that, you know, I have shut that door, and while they have the option to come through it, I can't completely blame them for not choosing that. And then I think modifying this idea of challenge support when you're working with these stressful interactions and anyone who's perpetrating microaggression. I think we almost kind of split it into two. We need to provide support for those affected by it, but I think there's also the option to give them some challenge and give them some direction. I think one of the hardest things about particularly microinvalidation is that you don't necessarily get to go back and confront that person. If you're experiencing that, you're not necessarily going to get to have the conversation, and some of our students want to have that. You know, I have students that say, I feel like they've misunderstood me. I feel like they assume some things, and I wish I could just sit them down and tell them who I really am. Well, in some situations, we have that option, either through the conduct process or just through our basic community building. We can do that. And so I think encouraging students to do that, you know, not forcing them to it, supporting them through the process, but giving them the opportunity to confront the people that harm them or hurt them. I think when it comes to the people who are doing it, whether intentional or not, we need to challenge them to make it right and to understand what's going on. That's not an easy proposition, and it's not always successful. However, I would also say provide them with some support. Those of us that have gone through some discussions about our own privilege and oppression, you know, we may remember how we might be experiencing it now, or remembering how stressful that was and how frustrating that was, and kind of dealing with how I've always felt with how I'm trying to change. You know, change is difficult. That's why they call it growing pains. And so I think providing some support there, providing follow-up, and being there for those students, but continuing to challenge and push them forward. So again, there we go, our responsibility. So I know we're getting near to the end of our time. Just so that you are aware, a number of resources will be posted on the website. If I can just get back, I'll show you kind of what I've got for you. So the PowerPoint, is my understanding, that will be posted on the website. In addition to that, I will include our lovely continuum with some suggestions and some examples. Please feel free to modify or use it as such. And then also I provided some case studies. So if you are here and one of maybe one or two people that are from your institute, you'd like to use this information or develop some training, I did provide some case study examples. I'll be upfront that these are all based exactly on experiences I've had probably in the past 24 months. So if you're looking at that and thinking, can we mess it up? Yeah, I might have done that once or twice in some of these situations. And some of these, I would say, went very well and you know, were resolved well. So all of those things will be available to you on the GLUHO website. And let's go back here. So I think there is a way for us to open up the floor for questions. Maybe Rudy can help me make sure that. So I would just very much for joining me. This is, you know, one of a few times that I've talked about this discussion, but definitely the first time in webinar format. So thank you for sitting through my nervousness and my stuttering and the invisible hand gestures that I've been doing back behind the screen. I really welcome any of your questions or discussion topics. I will do my best to get to as many as possible. For those of you that need to leave us early during that discussion, I appreciate that. Please take a look at all the resources will be there. And then also there will be an evaluation. I appreciate any and all constructive and positive feedback. So I'll open it up. Questions, questions, questions.
If anybody does have a question and would like to ask it verbally, if you could just click on the raise your hand button so that I can unmute you. We'll just go that route for right now so that I'm not unmuting everybody that maybe possibly isn't utilizing a mic or doesn't have the mic either and is just listening on speaker. So if you could just raise your hands and you have a question. If not,